Passed the first sector by 1/10. 2/10 in the second sector. And 4/10 in the last sector. In the second sector.
Yeah, you're not being clear. You said I'm fastest in the first sector.
Faster in the first sector.
Yeah, then you said 2/10 in the second sector. What does that mean?
4 seconds. 2/10 slower in the second sector. Charles pushing behind 2 seconds. And 4/10 slower in the last sector.
Can a single radio transmission change the course of a season? What Lewis Hamilton said at the end of the practices in Singapore will the blood freeze you. And no, it is not what you are thinking. Lewis Hamilton arrived in Singapore at the most vulnerable point that has been seen in years. What should be just another date in the calendar was transformed into an emotional catharsis that disarmed him before cameras, fans, and colleagues. And it is that Roscoe, his English bulldog, was not just a dog. It was his silent partner, his emotional anchor in a world that rarely offers stability. Roscoe's death just a few weeks before the Grand Prix not only hit Hamilton, but caused a wave of solidarity throughout the paddock. Engineers, journalists, fans, and even rivals sent messages. What seemed an intimate duel became, for a few days, the shared pain of the entire F1. But in that emotional crack, something else began to leak. In Singapore, Hamilton not only loaded with pain, he also transformed it. From the first day in the paddock, it was not the politically correct Lewis that appears in press conferences with calibrated answers. It was the most human Hamilton who admitted that he needs the car, the track, to the helmet, to rebuild. Every word that shared with the press showed that this weekend was not for points or statistics. It was personal. And when a pilot like Hamilton makes an intimate cause, performance can acquire a completely different dimension. The really remarkable thing is that this grieving and reconstruction process occurred just when his relationship with Ferrari seemed to stagger. After the difficulties in Baku, where he was left out in Q2 and expressed his radio frustration directly, criticism began to question whether Hamilton had made the right decision to leave Mercedes. The rumors were constant, that he did not understand the car, which did not communicate well with the engineers, that the SF25 driving style was in the antipodes of what he needed. And yet, in the midst of that internal and external storm, he decided to step forward. When getting out of the car behind Singapore practices, something different was noticed. It was no longer the same lost Hamilton of the first quotes of the calendar. Something had changed. And perhaps that change began, paradoxically, with the loss. The F1 is cruel and fast, but it is also the only place where Hamilton can channel everything that lives outside the path. Each curve, each braking, every return thrown, are a form of grief and at the same time of renaissance. Therefore, the man who sat on SF25 in Singapore was not simply a pilot. It was someone in search of purpose. Someone who decided to turn the vacuum into speed, the pain in concentration, and memory in motivation. Lewis Hamilton's phrase at the end of Singapore's Grand Prix practices was not simply a casual expression. It was a sentence that changed the narrative of the whole weekend. Guys, this car, it's starting to talk to me. Few pilots in the history of Formula One have the ability to transform a radio line into a technical and emotional manifesto. But when who says it is a 7 times world champion with more than a decade at the highest level, the impact is inevitable. That seemingly simple phrase condensed months of work, frustration, adaptation, and above all, the beginning of a relationship between pilot and machine that until that moment had been tense and distant. Since his arrival in Ferrari, Hamilton had fought to find a connection point with SF25. Unlike his time in Mercedes, where the car looked like an extension of his body, in Ferrari everything was new. The technical environment, the engineers, the configuration philosophy, the very language of the car. What other pilots get in winter, Lewis had to do it on the march, in the middle of an intense season and without margin of error. His frustration in Baku was a clear reflection of that disconnection. The radio of that day, loaded with discomfort for performance and strategic decisions, made it clear that the integration process was far from completing. But in Singapore, something changed. The Marina Bay circuit, due to its technical and demanding nature, does not forgive the lack of trust. Closed curves, constant rhythm changes, maximum traction demand. Only pilots completely in tune with their car can extract real performance. In that context, Hamilton not only achieved remarkable performance in practices, but also transmitted for the first time a sense of understanding with SF25. And most importantly, it was not a message manufactured for the media. It was a direct communication with his team without cameras or script, only between him and his engineers. That made it even more valuable. From the technical point of view, Ferrari had prepared a very specific package for this circuit. Unlike previous years, they opted for a medium-high aerodynamic load configuration, which required surgical management and precise management of adherence peaks. The big difference this time was that Hamilton not only accepted the technical proposal, but began to mold it. The simulator data, for the first time in the season, began to coincide with the real sensations on the track. The joint work between Lewis and the engineers, which in previous races seemed disconnected, was now perfectly synchronized. Hamilton's radio was, then, more than a statement. It was a part of war. A report that after weeks of internal combat with the car, the truce had arrived. But it was not a passive truce, it was the beginning of an alliance. The phrase, "is starting to talk to me," not only refers to the behavior of the car on the track, but to a technical perception that very few pilots can verbalize. The exact moment in which the car ceases to be an unstable tool and begins to offer consistent, intuitive, natural responses. For Ferrari engineers, that phrase was pure gold. Because beyond the chronos or partials, when a pilot like Hamilton feels that the car responds, it is a sign that the tuning, balance sheet changes, simulator work and technical decisions are starting to fit. That trust has a domino effect. More precision in the paths, lower wear in tires, better decisions in the strategy. And above all, a pilot willing to go to the limit because he no longer fears that the car will betray him. What began as a simple practical session ended up being one of the most significant moments of the season for Ferrari. Not for what was seen, but for what was heard. Because when a pilot such as Hamilton says that the car speaks to him, it is not a metaphor. It is a code. It is an internal sign that the technical war has changed the phase. The initial conflict has given way to construction. And from there, everything is possible. The 2025 Singapore Grand Prix marked an emotional and competitive point in the Lewis-Hamilton season, but even more importantly, marked the real start of his link with Ferrari. The radio message that closed the practical session was not an isolated act, but the climax of a transformation process that had been managing from the first preseason test. Singapore was the first time we saw him not only comfortable but fully committed to the car. Body language, the way he got off the car, the naturalness with which he spoke with engineers and serenity in his subsequent statements left no doubt. The British pilot was beginning to recognize himself again. That transformation did not happen overnight. From Australia to Baku, Hamilton had lived a roller coaster of performance, technical insecurity and media pressure. Each race seemed a personal struggle, not only against its rivals but against its own adaptation. Unlike what has lived in Mercedes, where each change was discussed within a system that he had helped to build for years, in Ferrari he had to learn from scratch. Not only were it new tools or methodologies, but a completely different philosophy, a technical culture impregnated with tradition and protocols. That transition, invisible to the general public, is one of the most complex for any elite pilot. But in Singapore, for the first time, that barrier broke. The most impressive thing was that this technical harmony was accompanied by emotional clarity rarely seen in Hamilton since its consecration in Mercedes. Losing Roscoe had been an open wound, but also a catalyst. Instead of hiding that pain, Lewis transformed it into impulse. The track, like so many other times in his life, was his refuge again. Not to escape their emotions, but to hug them with an intensity that led him to a higher level of concentration. The emotional connection that a constant had with Roscoe in his career, present in the paddocks, the trips and the intimate moments now was projected in his way of driving. There was no disconnection, but a channeling. Each return was a kind of silent tribute. Each braking, an act of absolute presence. Each curve, a reaffirmation that it was still there, whole, focused, determined. And that determination had visible consequences. In telemetric data, Ferrari engineers began to notice an improvement consisting of the curve entry phase, one of the weak points of the SF25 until that moment. Hamilton, by adopting a more progressive approach to the brake inspired by Leclerc's natural style, achieved better weight transfer, greater stability and cleaner traction in the exit of slow curves. It was not an improvised change. It was the direct application of weeks of analysis, simulation and adaptation. But in Singapore, finally, that theory became practice, and practice in real performance. It is also important to highlight the context in which all this happened. Singapore, with its nearby walls, its asymmetric curves and its thermal demand, is one of the most punishing paths of the calendar. There is no space for improvisation. If a car is not balanced or a pilot is not mentally connected, the result is the wall. But that weekend, Hamilton not only avoided mistakes, but showed a level of consistency that was not seen from his dominant stage. And that is no accident. The pilot was reuniting with himself, but now with a new environment, new colors, and a different mission. It was no longer about defending a legacy, but about building a new one from scratch. Because when a pilot like Hamilton says he is feeling the car again, it is not a loose phrase. It is a warning. It is the sign that the most dangerous is not the talent of its rivals, nor the points that separate it from the leadership. The most dangerous thing is that he has recovered confidence.